Why are people so obsessed with death? The dark fantasies of it, the own horror of imagining it. Does these dark thoughts and horrific stories help us cope with the fear of death? Horror is a feeling that will be stuck with you for a very long time. Horror is also a genre of fear, and it motivates us to be alive. Horror and death is everywhere on film, music, books, and even in real life.
Hope everyone's having a good spooky time this Halloween. It might not be as fun due to the COVID-19, but we will get through it together. It's not like a zombie apocalypse will happen, right?
There's always a hidden dark meaning behind everything. The darkest thoughts and imaginations come from within ourselves, and whatever is portrayed visually or descriptively comes from all of our ideas and nightmares, such as the entertainment business like films and games that shows us that. The horror genre, like I said, is basically expressing our fears creatively and overcoming them. The genre questions how would you react or even survive in a situation where you can't comprehend. Survival is the key objective to us and many other species in this world. Survival is part of the cycle of life and death, and horror tests the survival instincts within ourselves. Survival and horror has been around forever throughout history or since the beginning of life. Through wars, incidents, paintings, books, films, and now the social media, of course. Fear is the feeling that motivates us to survive. I would compare fear like hot sauce in food, or going on risky and daring adventures, or of course going on a roller coaster. We crave for that same feelings for horror movies or for horror entertainment, period. Horror movies came to surface around the late 1890s and early 1900s. The silent era of horror movies began during its time. These horror movies reflected on wars and the Great Depression. The 1920s through the 1940s dealt with the iconic Universal monsters or the first horror celebrities. These were the good old Gothic horror days. The 1950s dealt with the science fiction of horror. Nuclear bombs, mutations, beings from another world. And it was the start of the iconic British horror cinema, Hammer Horror. Hammer Horror revived the classic tales of the Universal monsters and made them deadlier, graphic, and satanic. Famous actors came to surface such as Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and Vincent Price. The 1960s dove deeper into the realism of people's fears such as serial killers, cults, and the undead. This was a time of peace and love until Charles Manson and the words Helter Skelter changed Hollywood. Movies were dying back then, so Grindhouse came along with cheap budget films that was more explicit. The 1970s officially broke the barrier. This was the decade that put old stuff to rest. With new villains, stories, color, and personality. The audience wanted more thrills and violence. Violent films and demonic films was a thing during its time. But it wasn't enough, not until the 1980s. The 80s changed the game of horror forever. The 80s made horror loved and popular. The movies were full of imagination and blood. Slasher movies were very popular, but other new, unique ideas for films came to surface. The special effects those days were amazing, and some of them were done by the legendary makeup artist, Tom Savini. The 80s was a simple time of good versus evil, and who would survive. Metal music and 80s music by general had a huge influence on these films, and horror movies overall has a huge influence on some bands. The 90s continued this formula until the modern era of horror came along with more blood, sex, ghosts, demons, remakes, and unique tales. A lot of TV shows and Netflix series were made to appeal to the audiences who loves the genre of horror. Horror will stick around forever whether people likes it or not. Music and horror always had chemistry to each other. Music and horror films changed the game and it worked perfectly. Most horror films has iconic themes that everyone will recognize to the end of times. There are many great composers for horror, such as John Carpenter, John Harrison, and Bernard Herrmann. Even the silent era of movies has creepy gothic music behind each terrifying scene. Most horror movies and TV have great soundtracks or albums with tons of music artists and other brilliant composers. It sucks today that many horror movies don't make any good music or soundtrack full of bands with creative music videos. Without music in horror, everything about it would be boring for the most part. Speaking of bands and other music artists, horror films has a great influence on some of them, such as Korn, Marilyn Manson, Rob Zombie, Rammstein, 30 Seconds to Mars, Metallica, Slipknot, and etc. Shit, even rappers are influenced by horror, or at least a fan of the dark aspects of it. I prefer my horror with rock and some metal. But yeah, 80s music went really well, like the Misfits, Iron Maiden, or Alice Cooper. The hidden meaning in each of their songs, or the hidden lyrics in each of the music videos of all these talented artists really reflect on the dark side of life.
Horror is not all about films and music, it's used in video games as well. Over the years, there's been over 100 horror games for Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation consoles. Gamers play these terrifying games to feel the mix of excitement and fear rushing through their veins. These games put you where these characters go through and expands more on the story and the lore than some horror films usually do. Video games are already interesting to begin with because they give you that sense of control and power. A popular subgenre in horror gaming is survival horror. Today's culture is really interested in these types of games. Of course, it doesn't have to be scary all the time. It could be mixed with action or comedy. At the same time, you know you found yourself a scary game if it's rated M, and the most talked game or considered a trending game. Though the level of scariness and violence does get hammered down by critics in some audiences, to the point it could be controversial. It's still not a bad idea to have fun and get spooky playing video games once in a while.
Whoa! Oh!
Yeah, okay.
Hey, I'm Chucky from Curse of Chucky, out October 8th.
Today, horror is loved by many fans who support these stories, characters, and the crew who creates these nightmares. It's everywhere. Merchandising, haunted houses, books, cereals, art, comics, haunted mazes, pretty much anything really. Fans like me, too, will always have a special place and heart for horror. During these tough times such as COVID-19, we are limited of the stuff we want to do. Life is a horror movie right now. The best thing we can do is to fight it and overcome it, just like any other fear. Just think of yourself as Ash or Tommy Jarvis, or Ripley for the ladies. Horror will never die. Horror is forever.
No, I'm pretty well adjusted. Now, Jason, that freak has serious problems. I mean, a hockey mask?